Afternoon and good evening to those of you in Europe, and good morning to those of you in Australia and Japan. Welcome to Session 6 of the ESIG 2021 Meteorology and Market Design for Grid Services Workshop on the topic of tail event concerns from around the world. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of ESIG, and I'll provide a few brief opening remarks. As I think you know by now, our workshop sessions are all being held online and are open to everyone. And I do want to let you know that we're planning our first major in-person event since the COVID outbreak last year, with the Fall Technical Workshop in Austin, Texas, during the week of October 25th. Please mark your calendars and look for additional information in the near future. This workshop was planned with the input of our ESIG Offerings Committee, chaired by Bethany Frew of NREL and Julia Matoy-Vasan of ERCOT. The committee consists of the chairs of our 6 working groups and several of our board members. We have a great set of volunteers who really make ESIG what it is, and we encourage you to become involved if you're not already. You can find us on the web at esig.energy, send an email to info@esig.energy to get our monthly newsletter, and follow our activities on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. ESIG also serves a leadership role in the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, often called GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors from around the world to catalyze a rapid, clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and scale. ESIG leads one of the 5 pillars that deals with the research agenda for the system operators. More information on GPST can be found at globalpst.org. Regarding logistics for today, I would ask you to note that Session 6 will be an hour and a half long. We had a lot of feedback that our 1-hour workshop sessions were too rushed, so we've moved to some longer formats for this workshop. We will have 3 individual presentations of approximately 15 to 20 minutes each in the first part of the session, followed by approximately 25 minutes of discussion and Q&A after the last speaker. As we are doing with all of our webinars now, we'll be using the Slido platform for managing the Q&A. You should go to slido.com on your device and enter ESIG17 as the event code to ask your questions. Please be sure to indicate the person to whom you're addressing the question. The instructions are also at the bottom of the background slide for the webinar, and you'll be reminded by the session chair. You'll see a thumbs up button next to the question on Slido to allow you to vote on prioritizing the questions submitted. So please keep the questions coming during the presentations, and we will address them at the end. We will follow up with written answers to any questions we don't get to during the Q&A. Recognizing the limitations of a webinar with more than 100 people on the lines will be muted. So again, we ask you to use the Slido platform to ask your questions with ESIG17 as the event code. Today's session is titled Tail Event Concerns from Around the World. This is a hot topic on most everyone's radar screen these days, especially with the recent Texas event, which is covered elsewhere in this workshop, and the heat and wildfire concerns as illustrated recently in California and Australia. We have a fine lineup of practitioners from the UK, Australia, and Japan who will explore different aspects of this topic, and I'm looking forward to a great session and discussion. The session will be chaired by Mark O'Malley of UC Dublin, currently serving as Chief Scientist for Energy Systems Integration at ESIG. Mark is a well-known figure in the energy systems integration space, chair of our Research and Education Working Group, and a leader in the Global Power System Transformation Initiative. He is also only one of a few foreign members of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering. Mark is the only friend I ever loaned a shirt to after he lost his suitcase on a trip, who then complained because it wasn't 100% cotton. As you can see, he's a man of very high standards. He's a regular contributor to ESIG activities and is well known to many of you. He brings a lot of good experience and insight, and we're very happy to have him here with us today. Mark, we appreciate your participation, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Okay, can you hear me? Thank you, Charlie. So I think it's interesting. Yep. I didn't like wearing non-cotton shirts years ago, but I'm now wearing a Lululemon completely artificial synthetic t-shirt. So I've evolved, Charlie. Okay, so welcome everyone to this session. We have 3 interesting speakers for you today, one from the UK, one from Australia, and one from Japan. And I think one of the important things is to point out that this session does not have a single person from North America involved. I'm from Ireland, Matthew's from the UK, Ellise is from Australia, and Yo's from Japan, which is a very good sign for ESIG as it starts to become more international. I do have to point out, though, that Ellise and Yo, it's 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, respectively, for each of them. So I think you should all be very appreciative of their efforts to be here on time. I just hope they haven't fallen asleep. Okay, we're going to get straight into it. The first speaker will be Matthew Magill. His title for his job is he's the Zero Carbon Operations Manager, which is very interesting. I don't think a few years ago you would have ever come across a title like that for a job. He's worked in National Grid for 20 years. He's a University of Bristol graduate, as far as I know. And he's going to talk to you now about his experience of operating through COVID. And I think COVID was probably one of the ultimate tail events of the century. So I think it's very appropriate. Okay, Matthew, it's all over to you. Go for it.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for having me here today. So yeah, I am, will be the Zero Carbon Operation Manager at National Grid ESO, but I've spent the last year effectively managing our response to COVID. So National Grid ESO, we're responsible for keeping the lights on in Great Britain, which is England, Wales and Scotland. And we set out 2 key priorities at the start of the COVID pandemic. One was keeping our people safe and protecting their well-being. We have operational people working in control rooms. We needed to make sure we could continue to do that. That was our key critical aspect. Secondary to that was keeping the lights on and coping with the low periods of demand due to the UK lockdown. So we were watching what was going on in France, Spain, Italy as lockdown started in early 2020. And we started to realise that this was going to happen to us as well. And what we saw from COVID across those countries was a dramatic suppression in demand. With everybody locked in at home, economic activity ceasing, there was a big step change in the amount of demand that we're seeing on our system. Now, we've been aware for years that there is a coming issue of low demands over our summer periods. So this is something we were thinking about getting ready for in the mid-decade, and I'll touch on our approach to this. But effectively, as lockdown started in Great Britain, this chart shows, you can see we're picking out each of the different points of the day, each of our cardinal points of the day, and you can see the effect of when the lockdown was introduced. There was a big shift change in demand and suppression. So this is what we're expecting to see and what we actually saw with COVID. So by the end of March, we were seeing sort of 15 to 20% demand suppression at some points during the day. And that started us thinking. We'd already started prepping, but effectively we knew we had a challenge to come up with. So what happens when the demand goes lower in Great Britain is effectively our energy mix changes. Our system has a large proportion of wind, large proportion of solar, large proportion of nuclear. They are effectively must-run baseload units, so they will take up the lion's share of the demand when possible. And then it is generally topped up by markets providing that extra energy either through biomass or CCGTs or other fuel sources. But as the demand dropped, we knew that the marginal units, the gas-fired power stations, would be the units that were less likely to run. And that provided us quite a few challenges. So we were looking into COVID, and our primary focus at the end of March as COVID was kicking in was actually how bad could this get? What could our demands go to? And that was the big challenge to start off with, because we needed something to ground us to understand the challenge and the problem that we were looking at. So we spent a lot of time researching what had been going on in France, Spain, rebuilding our demand models, looking at what the expected extremes could be, what the volatility, what the uncertainty was that gave the baseline. We then had an approach in National Grid, we called it our operability obeyer, which was looking at what we define as our 5 key security work streams around voltage, making sure that we keep voltage in the network safe and secure, stability, so this is have we got the right short circuit level, inertia and other power system capability to make sure that the system responds in the way we expect it to. Can we manage the thermal flows across the network? Can we react to losses on our system? We have an island system, we've got quite a small system, peak demand about 50 gigawatts, minimum demand before COVID was about 20 gigawatts. So making sure that for any large power station losses, we have up to 1200 megawatt power station losses in GB, that we can contain the frequency. And then lastly, our restoration capability. So in the event of a black start capability, do we have the right restoration capability? So we have this operability of air that was focusing on 2025, 2030, making sure that we could meet those requirements. What we realized as COVID kicked off, that what we were expecting to happen mid-decade 2025 in terms of the energy mix that we'd be seeing was actually going to hit us in a few weeks. So what we then had to understand was with those demands, so we were looking at the previous minimum demand prior to COVID was 17.8 gigawatts. We were looking at 14.4 down to potentially 12.6 gigawatt demands over April, May, June as the lockdown continued. So we quickly spun up and responded with getting experts from across all areas of National Grid together, pretty much on a daily basis, running studies, running analysis, sharing information, iterating to get us to a requirement. We then were looking at what was going on in the market, what capacity was still available, were people getting impacted, were power stations getting impacted by COVID, what was happening to prices. Prices were falling through the floor in GB, so again, that issue of gas-fired power stations were pretty much self-declaring themselves off, and would we still have the provision of balancing services we needed? So we're running that iterative process, coming up with our requirements, trying to understand what we needed to do. And then we needed to work out, actually, with what we need to happen, does it all fit in? And that was the real big challenge, because when we actually did all the calculations and worked it all out, we realized we didn't have enough demand to have enough units on the system to be able to manage what we needed to do. So I'm just going to take a quick deep dive into where that challenge really came out. Effectively in GB, we're ready for 2025. We've got a plan for 2025. One of the things we've got to do before 2025 is we have a large proportion, 20 to 30,000 small embedded generations embedded in the distribution networks in GB, under 5 megawatts, under 1 megawatt, that have all got a specific type of protection on it called loss of mains to protect it in the event of it being disconnected from the network. And there are two types of loss of mains protection. One is rate of change of frequency relays, and the other is vector shift. So if the rate of change of frequency is too high, these units will disconnect. And vector shift relays, if they see a transmission fault close to them when the inertia on the system is low, they can also see and disconnect. So we have this effective large amount of generation, up to 700 megawatts of rock-off and up to 1500 megawatts of vector shift at the time of generation that could activate for an unforeseen event. So this became our main risk that we had to cover. So we know on our system what our largest losses are. We calculate what the inertia is. We're bringing in inertia measurement services this year that will actively monitor what's going on the network. But effectively, we know how big our loss is. We know what the inertia on the system is. So we know what our rate of change of frequency could be. So we have to maintain a certain level of inertia to make sure that 700 megawatts of embedded generation doesn't consequentially loss and cause a big frequency event. So we know what inertia we need for the loss size, and then we're also looking at these vector shift relays. So a transmission fault on parts of our network can trigger up to 1500 megawatts, depending upon the load factors of those generators. But what we were actually seeing when we were doing all the analysis and plotting what was going to happen was that under high wind, high sun, solar scenarios, the vector shift loss exceeded our trigger. So we'd have a transmission fault, you could lose your vector shift, you would then have a rate of change of frequency greater than 0.125 hertz, and you would then get a further loss. And these consequential losses would be too great for our system to cope with, and we would be effectively using our emergency low frequency demand disconnection relays to cut off demand to maintain system security. So what that got us to was we could see periods where we would need to put on an additional 17 to 20, I think our maximum we ever got to was 28 CCGT, so large 600-700 megawatt machines, to get the inertia of the system up to a point that we could cope with any transmission losses we were seeing. So that created a massive problem, because getting 17, 20, 22 CCGTs on the system, each of them has got a minimum export level, the minimum amount they can get on the system. And that created a problem in terms of, does everything fit? So we've done lots of these, but just to take you through this chart. So effectively, that big blue bar in the middle is our transmission system demand. So what we're planning on seeing the demand from the transmission system. That transmission system is going to be effectively suppressed by embedded solar and wind. So solar and wind connected not to the transmission network, but connected to distribution and embedded networks. And that gives you your true demand on that right-hand side. But what we were focused on is the left-hand side, left of that blue bar in the middle. So you can see over the summer, we were forecasting about 5.5 gigawatts of nuclear plant. Nuclear plant in GB is very inflexible, likes to run base load. We've then got that CCGT and biomass, that pink bar, and that is where we were needing to add energy in. We've got interconnectors in GB. We are an island nation, but we do have DC interconnectors that allow us to export energy off our network. And then we've got a large proportion of wind power on our network as well. And that wind power is very expensive to get off the system. So we try and leave it alone as much as possible. And then we've also got a certain amount of capacity of pump storage, but that pump storage is time limited. There's only a certain number of gigawatt hours that we can get up a mountain in terms of the water to manage our network. So what we were looking at as we were running into the summer was, with the nuclear, the wind, maximum interconnector exports, maximum pump storage capability, we couldn't get enough CCGTs and biomass onto the system without exceeding our demand. So we were really running into a really hard, difficult problem of how are we going to manage moving through the entire COVID period when we don't have enough demand to provide the services we need. So what did we do? Well, we went out to the CCGTs that we knew we were going to be running and spoke to them and contracted with them to try and get them to work. They've effectively got commercial minimum levels, and then they've got technical minimum levels that they can run at. So we struck a number of contracts with units to get them to be able to synchronize to the network, but producing less megawatts. So the problem was we needed to get less megawatts on the system, still provide enough service. So we got some of that. We also stepped up our engagement, and this is one of the key things that we learned from COVID, is how important it is to get government, regulator, network owners, market, industry players all sharing thinking. So we're running regular events trying to get everybody involved, explain the problem, see what came out of the woodwork. We were not trying to do this on our own. We would have failed if we tried to do this on our own. So getting everybody involved and understanding the problem was one of our key activities at the beginning. We quickly identified that one of the main issues that we were seeing in our studies, it's coming back to this chart, is that embedded solar and wind. So we didn't prior to COVID have access or any ability to control or reduce the outputs from that embedded solar and wind. So what we had to do effectively in a very short period of time, so from effective, we need to do this, to a product going live, we created a new product in 3 weeks. I think at the least amount of time, I don't think we've ever done anything in less than 12 months. So we got this product out, we got industry involved, we got 4 gigawatts of new entrants to this market. And the product was called ODFM, strange title, but optional dynamic downward flexibility margin product. And this was about getting wind, solar, and other people who we couldn't access through our normal commercial tools to be able to reduce their output. And this was one of the key enablers to get us through the challenge. So we'd got those CCGTs to come on with less power. We then went and looked at the solar, and we got up to 4 gigawatts. That gave us lots of space. It wasn't cheap. The other thing we looked at was we did speak to EDF, who own all of the nuclear power plants in the UK, and said, actually, is there one big thing we can do with you to get the amount of baseload power off the network reduced? We struck a large contract with EDF with their Sizewell B power station, 1260 megawatt unit, two 660 megawatt units, and we got one of those units off the system for the summer to give us that comfort during the uncertainty of COVID. We also, you've got plans, you need to know what happens when your plans run out. We've got a number of emergency instruction capabilities, but actually when we started talking to our providers and industry players about using those, suddenly lots of issues that have been bubbling up in the background for years suddenly came to the forefront. So we got quick regulatory changes in to make sure we could still use those emergency instructions and still do the activities that we wanted to do. We were going to spend a lot of money. I said getting wind off the network. The main way of getting those CCGTs onto the network was taking wind off. So we were looking at the way GB market works. The National Grid ESO spends the money. We socialise the cost against all the people that were on the network at the time. So when we were talking to providers, cash flow was becoming quite a concern. So we got up to £100 million worth of costs deferred out of 2021 into 2022, just to give people support and confidence that they could participate and active without having major cash flow problems. We've got a lot of batteries coming onto GB system. We've developed a new product this year. We've got over 700 megawatts of fast acting response from batteries, but we weren't maximizing the capabilities from batteries as we were going into COVID. So we ran a really quick trial to understand how we could use batteries within existing market frameworks more effectively. And then the last thing we did was actually went and got some other people to just come and look at what we'd done, check it, and make sure we hadn't screwed it up. Because one of the big things was this was so quick, so big, we needed support, and asking for that support was really critical. So when we layered all of those things in, what did we get to? And we got to a system that ran without hesitation, without blips, without uncertainty throughout the entire summer, throughout all the COVID uncertainty. Where does that get us to in the future? Just going to really touch on this quickly, Mark. So it's really enabled us to think about the challenges we're going to be seeing by 2025. So National Grid ESO, my new job title, we're aiming to be able to operate our system carbon-free some of the time in 2025, not all of the time. And it's really laid out what the challenges were. So COVID has given us a really good insight to where we need to get to, and reinforced all the plans that we're working against those 5 security air work streams to make sure we can fix the network and be able to manage the transition in an effective way. I'm going to leave you at that. Thanks, Mark.
Sorry, yeah, there you go. Okay, that was very good. Thanks, Matthew. I think it's really, really interesting. You know, don't waste a crisis, if you know what I mean. So you got things through in a couple of weeks. I suppose regulators and people like that delay things when they can, I suppose. But it's really interesting that COVID and zero carbon are bedfellows here in terms of how they work together. So there's always some good to come out of things. Okay, we'll have some questions for you at the end. Okay, our next speaker is Ellise Harmer. I hope that she hasn't gone asleep, and she has, I wouldn't blame her. So Ellise has been with AEMO for 6 years in Australia, the Australian Electricity Market Operator, and she's in charge of short-term forecasting and function. And she's a mathematics and computer science graduate from the University of South Australia. Okay, Ellise, the floor is yours. Oh, I'm sorry, just one more thing for everybody. Don't forget Slido, ESIG 17. We've got one question in there, but I'm sure there's more. So Ellise, up to you.
Very much, Mark. So taking a little bit of a change of tact now. I haven't focused on COVID for this. I've looked at weather events and some of the tail events we've seen over the past few years since I've been in the role. They seem to be increasing, and I know that's not the definition of a tail event, but they seem to be happening more and more. So just quickly, we've got a bit of a disclaimer there. So the 3 things I've sort of focused on today to look at are dust storms, bushfire, smoke, and cool changes and thunderstorms. With each of them, I'm going to link back into the growth of renewable energy, and particularly wind and solar. In Australia, we're starting to see impacts on the system due to these events that we haven't seen before. And we're starting to learn new and different ways for these things to challenge us. So just putting a little bit more sort of context on it, we run the longest power system in the world. It's called the National Electricity Market. It supplies about 200 terawatts of energy with a system peak of about 35 gigawatts. And we break it up into 5 regions. The sort of 3 regions I'm going to focus on today are in the southern region. So we've got South Australia, where I am, to the far west there of the NEM in the south, and then Victoria, where Melbourne is, and New South Wales, where Sydney is. So just putting a little bit more context on it for our system operations, our rooftop solar installations are now over 12 gigawatts in the NEM. So when I say rooftop solar, they're installations below 100 kilowatts, and they're behind the meter. We actually saw installation rates accelerate, and the size per installation has accelerated as well. And COVID's one factor to that as to why they've accelerated, with people at home doing all their home renos, saving lots of money, not traveling the world. We've seen acceleration in the rooftop solar growth. COVID's also increased our weather demand response relationship with more people working from home. But aside from that, we haven't had a huge impact of COVID on our grid. So we've got 12 gigawatts of rooftop solar. We also have now about 13 gigawatts of large-scale wind and solar generation on the system. So this has all sort of been connected since 2007, but you can see in the past 3 years, we've had a real acceleration of growth, particularly on the large-scale solar, so the front of meter sort of solar. So now on a system peak of about 35 gigawatts, we've got about 12 gigawatts of rooftop solar behind the meter and about 13 gigawatts of grid-connected wind and solar generation. So taking that into context, we're now looking at these events that probably didn't bother us so much previously and now do. So the first one I've sort of looked at is dust storms. So dust storms in Australia occur over major metropolitan regions probably a few times a year. Traditionally, they haven't really posed us a major risk to the grid. However, with the increased penetration of solar, obviously this risk is increasing. So you can see on this satellite image, down to the south, there's a little bit of pinky red colouring in the cloud on this day. What was happening was we had northerly winds blowing topsoil, dirt and dust from northern Australia, and this is down across South Australia and into Adelaide. The two challenges we're really seeing with dust storms are that the storm can be masked by the satellite imagery. So because the dust storm's right at the surface layer, the cloud sits above that, you've then got the satellite that takes the imagery from above there. You can't really see it on the satellite. Our rooftop solar forecasting and large-scale solar forecasting systems track clouds. It has cloud motion vectoring capability in it, using the satellite to project forward what's going to happen. If the dust is sitting underneath the cloud, it's not really evident that well in the satellite and it struggles to model it. We do have some challenging forecasting conditions when the dust storms blow through. Secondly, obviously, weather models don't necessarily forecast a dust storm. So we're really reliant on meteorological expertise. So we're reliant on our Bureau of Meteorology. But that information is often sort of qualitative to manage the storm. So to date, we haven't had huge system impacts due to a storm, but it's getting bigger every year that one of these comes through. So just to have a look at what that looks like. On this day, this is the flex in the rooftop solar in South Australia. So South Australia has the highest installed capacity, highest penetration of rooftop solar of any of our regions. And you can see what the dust storm did to the rooftop solar, particularly in the morning there, till about 12 o'clock. During the day, the red line there is the actual generation, held it right in, didn't quite get the forecast right. And then as the storm actually cleared just ahead of the cool change that was moving in, the solar shot right up. And then, of course, we had a cool change move in. We had some more cloud come across and the solar dropped off again. So again, the reverse of that on the demand as rooftop solar is behind the meter. You can see we had quite a volatile demand that day against the forecast, and particularly that morning period was the one that sort of got us and actually caused some interesting price outcomes in the market. So from about sort of 10 in the morning till 12 o'clock there, where the load was higher than expected, where the solar was being held down. So moving on, but with a similar tact, just one more slide on that is what we do with the generation when we've got such a flex in that solar. So this is the South Australian generation mix that day. Because it's so windy with a dust storm, obviously there's a lot of wind generation. We have a lot in South Australia as well. So you can see the bulk of the generation in the region is made up by the green, the wind. Unlike in the UK, we can curtail the wind quite readily. So you can see in the middle of the day around 1300 there when the solar flexed, the wind did come off to some extent. Important to note here, the light blue at the bottom is the gas generation that we require to be on for system strength. So there's a minimum level of gas generation that must be on at all times in South Australia for system strength and inertia purposes. And then what we've really flexed with on this day is the interconnector. So you can see anything below the zero there is export across into Victoria where Melbourne is. And that's really what we use to flex on this day to be able to absorb the impacts of the changing system. So, you know, while this is all good when your interconnector is intact, we do obviously sometimes have outages planned and unplanned on the interconnector, and that becomes a real challenge to manage this sort of variability. So now moving on to a similar sort of tact, I suppose, but different tail event is bushfire smoke. So it was very well documented that we had a number of challenges in the 2019-2020 season in Australia, some of the worst bushfires we've ever seen. And obviously it was quite a challenging season for managing the power system. So I've just grabbed this day in particular. This was the 4th of January, 2020. It's quite burned into my mind. You can see the smoke there on the satellite image across most of Victoria and New South Wales blowing out across onto the coast. Should point out that most of the Australian population actually lives on the coast, so most of our load is out there. The bushfires have been burning for months at this point. It was the peak of summer temperatures and a cool change was moving up the coast, so we had elevated winds, increased fire danger. This was the day that we saw 49 degrees in parts of Western Sydney. So 49 degrees for those that work in Fahrenheit is 120 Fahrenheit. We lost interconnection between Victoria and New South Wales as the fires moved under the transmission lines. We activated our emergency reserves in New South Wales following the loss of the interconnector. So what does bushfire smoke do? Aside from the sort of obvious impact to transmission lines and things, didn't quite have the impact on the load and the forecasting that we thought it would. So there was some impact to solar production across the state, both on the large scale plant and the rooftop solar. If anyone's sort of interested in that, we've got a report that I've linked at the end by a company called Ampron that did investigate further the impacts into the solar from the bushfire smoke. But surprisingly, what we saw was we had quite mixed impacts on the load. So what happened was, because weather models don't forecast smoke, so weather models don't look at any smoke impact really and what that's going to do to temperatures, but the smoke was so heavy over the metropolitan regions that it was actually holding out some of the sun, so we weren't getting the full extent of the heating that we're expecting. And this is another day, this is the 21st of November there, and in the dark line at the bottom, that was our forecast of our temperatures against the yellow of the actual, and you can see the actual sat under for most of the day, which is quite uncommon in an Australian heatwave. And interesting, the load came out kind of on balance to where our forecast was, where the red there is the load and the orange was the forecast. So what sort of happened, as I said, is the weather models don't model smoke. We ended up with the smoke really limiting the heating from the sun. Didn't get as hot as expected. But then what we saw as the opposite to that, where the load would have been lower because it didn't get as hot, was there was a real behavioural effect as well. So because the air quality was so poor, people stayed inside a lot. They weren't out doing their normal day-to-day business. And so we saw what we've called it model deviations here, but essentially the model was unable to capture, our demand forecasting model was unable to capture the sort of behavioural effect, and it balanced right out. So it looked on the surface like we had really good forecasting capability on these days, but what was actually happening underneath was the weather was well overblown, but then the model wasn't keeping up with the behavioural effects underneath of people staying at home, you know, shutting all their blinds and windows, running their air conditioning as hard as could be. Interesting to note here, the sort of purple colour was the rooftop solar deviations on the day, or the errors on the day here in New South Wales. Our solar forecasting system tracks, as I said, it's got cloud motion vectoring, it can track the satellite. It actually did an okay job. We didn't have too much problems with the rooftop solar, but at the rate it's growing, I can't say that that's necessarily always going to be the case in the future. So just moving on to my last little event here, and I've called it cool changes and thunderstorms, but there's all sorts that goes on in terms of a tail event for us with cool changes. So our system is summer peaking. So cool changes move through following a heat wave. They're often our hardest days operationally. So this is because at this point you're likely to have coincident heat across most of our regions, probably the highest heat of the weather pattern, increasing winds and associated thunderstorm risks. So this particular day, another one that's burned in my mind, is the 31st of January 2020. So this was just following the fires and the major events there. What you can see just on a quick synoptic there is that the cool change was moving in across the south of Australia, but there's actually a low pressure system over the west, and what that was doing was generating a lot of moisture. So we had northerly winds pulling that moisture down, the winds were increasing as a front approached the south of the country. So to put a little bit more context on it, these are the temperatures for the day in Victoria as that front approach. So Victoria is where Melbourne is. You can see that most of the state was above sort of 42 degrees, that's 108 Fahrenheit for those that work in Fahrenheit. So the higher country was in the high 40s, the rest of it was in the sort of mid 40 degrees. The thunderstorm outlook for the day is on the right there, with severe thunderstorms likely over the western parts of the state. And this is where our interconnection lies across to South Australia. So as the moved in, this happened. So because we had associated thunderstorms, we actually had a convective downburst. This brought down a number of towers on the South Australian Victorian interconnector. As a result, we lost our support capacity from South Australia into Victoria. Cool change hadn't yet reached Melbourne, but it had been through Adelaide, where I live. So we had spare capacity in South Australia. We were bringing over the interconnector into Victoria to support the load there. One of the biggest loads I've seen since I've been in this job in Victoria. So interconnector went down. We did lose a little bit of load along the interconnector. That load, interestingly, actually lives in Victoria, but sat on the South Australian side of the loss of the line. So they managed to subsequently restore that load, included in the SA island. And we ran an islanded system for, I think it was just a bit over a fortnight following the incident, until they were able to get some temporary towers and things strung up and get us reconnected to the rest of the country. They're actually, while there was a lot going on this day, the thing I wanted to focus on was the wind generation and what that did, because we saw some really interesting and challenging outcomes from the wind generation. So this is wind generation in Victoria on this day. The red is the actual generation. The forecasts at different hours ahead of there. The one you really want to take note of is the drop in actual generation around lunchtimes, around 12 o'clock through to about 4 p.m. And the forecasts didn't pick it really. That 12 and 4 hour ahead forecast sat quite high. The 30-minute ahead forecast kind of just follows what the wind's doing, so you can see that tried to adapt. On a bit of post-event analysis, we discovered actually 4 things happened, all differently to some of the wind farms in Victoria on this day. So we had a network outage. As the interconnector went down, we lost one of the farms. It was disconnected from the network. We then had low wind dropout. So as this cool change moved in, you get bands of rain. The bands of rain really tend to drop the wind out. So there was low wind dropout, the farms dropped off. We also had high wind cutout. So the wind was high enough for the turbines to derate and switch off. But one that we really experienced last summer, which was a first for us, was high temperature cutout on the wind farms. So the temperatures got so high that at hub height, that the farms started cutting out. So this is just an example of one farm. Here you can see what it did on the day. So looking sort of around that lunchtime kind of time there, you can see the dark line at the top is the temperature. You can see the temperature started to get over 40 degrees Celsius at hub height and up to nearly 45 degrees Celsius as that change started to move in and the wind started to pick up. You can see the wind there when it cut out was above sort of 10 meters per second or so. So plenty of wind for it to be generating, but we did lose all generation at that site on high temperature cutout. And then you can see it sort of recovered around 3 p.m. We got the generation back as the temperatures dropped off as the cool change moved in. But then of course the winds dropped right out as the rain came in and we lost the farm again on low wind cutout. So there were quite a few things rattling around that day that were quite a challenge, particularly in the wind forecasting. It wasn't quite there when we needed it. So just in summary, with the increased installations of wind and solar generation, we're finding new and different and fantastic weather events that are now having large impacts on our system that didn't previously. They can often be very difficult to forecast for us in a meaningful way because they are these tail events, and they're also new. They're things we haven't had to look at previously quite like we do now. And we're of course just continuing to work with the forecast industry to get that up. And I've just provided a couple of references for information.
Okay, Ellise, very good, extremely good actually. It looks like you were lucky times there, yeah? Yeah, two wrongs made a right on several occasions, correct?
Yeah, it always surprises me how, I don't know whether it's luck or good management, sometimes we manage to get through.
I don't think it was good management, I think it was basically luck. Okay, I think that's a fascinating talk, fascinating. Okay, our last speaker will be Yasuda, a gentleman I've known for many years in Japan. So Yo belongs to the research project on renewable energy economics for the Graduate School of Economics at Kyoto University. He is an electrical engineer, though he made it clear to me he's not an economist. So his current research interests are in the optimal social design, combining engineering, economics, and policy. So Yo is going to talk about an event that I heard about myself through friends of mine who trade electricity in Japan, actually, that there was a very interesting sort of tail event or an event, we'll let Yo explain it, but it uncovered a very interesting market design flaw in Japan. Okay, Yo, over to you. Yo.
Can you hear me?
No. I can't see you. We can hear you though, Yo. We can hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, my computer suddenly shut down. Sorry, so I restart to connect. So it is okay for me to start my presentation.
Yeah, no, sorry. Go ahead. We don't need you to have the camera. It's fine. Okay, go on, Yo. We can see your slide.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for Charlie and Mark for inviting me this workshop. So today, I'd like to introduce a Japanese experiment that happened in this January. We had a serious tail event in the electricity market for 3 weeks in this winter. However, this was neither due to extremely weather nor renewables. I will tell you what happened, what really happened in Japan. Well, yes, before starting my talk on the tail event, I will briefly show you the market structure in Japan, because it is quite unique and far from the mature market like US and Europe and Australia. Because as I show you in this graph, you can see.
Hold on, Yo.
Yes.
Yo, this graph. I mean, have you moved on the slides? Because I just see the same slide. Have you moved the slides on?
Yes, I'm showing the page 2.
It's fine. Yeah, it's fine. You're on page 2 now. It just took a little time. Sorry, Yo. But
I'm talking on the graph on the slide 2. Okay.
Great. No, that's fine. It might have been my system. Sorry, Yo. Go on.
Yes, and can you see my highlight by the yellow?
Yes.
Like this? Okay.
Yes, we can.
So I'll restart. As shown in this graph, even after the deregulation in 2016, the big 9 utilities dominate almost 80% for total trade energy. And this is evident is a highly oligopolistic situation. And according to the formal announcement by the Japanese government, the share of electricity market in Japan is approximately 40% like this. However, it consists of 23% gross bidding trade by the big 9. So in actual, it can be said the actual trade energy is only 8% like this here. So next graph is shows what happened in the market in Japan in this winter. As you can see, the spot price did not only rise like this, but also continue for 3 weeks like this. And the blue line illustrates the bid for sale, and the green line is actual contract. And the yellow one is difference from blue to green. So you can see easily understand all bid for sale have been sold out for 3 weeks here. So this is quite abnormal situation that might never happen in the world. Okay, this is the same graph that's shown in the previous slide, but drawn from the through the year. It is clear that the event is quite rare case through the year where all the bid for sales are sold out, only for the peak. Also, the right graph, light bar chart shows the frequency of the sold out situation during the last 5 years. You can see sold out period more than 400 times within 3 weeks in this winter, which situation have merely happened ever. To compare with the similar tail event all over the world, I'll show you the sample in Texas on this February, as you know very well. Certainly, huge high spikes occurred in this event, due to extremely weather condition. But the period of high price has been converged within 7 days. Another sample also comes from the Texas in August 2019. At the time, you have also high spikes, but it was quite intermittent and within 4 days. Another sample comes from the UK, which was originally caused by the trouble in French nuclear reactors. In this period, the period with relatively high price continued over 2 months, but the frequency of the high spike more than 1,000 GB pounds per megawatt hour was quite a few, like this. So I made a similar graph with the UK event like this for the current Japanese situation. This is the frequency of the high price in the Japanese market. The period with high price over 100 Japanese yen per kilowatt hour was counted over 100 times. So you can easily understand how abnormal situation the event was. So to analyze and evaluate why the event happened, I try to break down the possible case according to the market structure. The first one, primary cause, is related to generator. As I showed you in the slide before, we can see clearly the curious response in the curve of the bid for sale. There was a sudden reduction in December, and high price continued 3 weeks. However, why the high price continued for 3 weeks? I'll show you the reason later. The second and third one are categorized those for regulators and retailers. I'll also talk on this issue in the second half of my presentation. Well, during the event in this winter, many media and critics argued it was due to the cold weather, and many people, including policymakers, believe so. But according to our investigation, like this graph, the weather in this winter in Japan was not so extreme. This is the average one, and this is the actual one. And during the event, the bid for sale in the market were always constant, independent from the temperature. So it can be concluded that the market behavior was not caused by cold weather. Okay, another argument from the media was it was caused by the photovoltaics, unstable renewables. However, the argument has completely denied because according to the investigation by the Renewable Energy Institution Japan, both of the output power and energy are much higher than the previous year, like this. So photovoltaics did not cause a high price, but rather contributed in the lower the price during the daytime. After 2 weeks later than the beginning of the event, METI Japan announced the fact of the LNG stocks in Japan. Normally in Japan, there has not been published information on stock of gas to all the players. So it is not quite transparent at all for market players, especially new players expect of the big nine that holds their internal information on gas stock. After 1 month later than the end of the event, EMSC Electricity and Gas Market Surveillance Commission in Japan published the market behaviors by the big nine, the oligopolistic companies like this. This graph clearly shows one of the big nine, Kansai and EPCO, took strange behavior, market behavior like this, where C intermittently stops the gross bidding and trading by market in December. And finally, C stops the gross bidding at all for 3 weeks. The period was completely coincident that of the event. So, after careful investigation by one of the co-researchers, it became evident that Kansai EPCO failed to restart her 2 nuclear reactors, which was originally planned to restart before winter peak. Unfortunately, the colors in this slide are shown, but this is a schedule for the inspection planned outage. However, the actual one is like this, the lower table. The rescheduling was due to minor trouble like a pipeline and the steam generator. Like this. So what happened in Japan in this winter? So more than 2 gigawatts capacity suddenly shortage, and this became clear in mid-December. So there were no nuclear in this season. So the big nine intended to buy the additional LNG from gas spot market to compensate the shortage, but there were time delay to import. So this is why the Kansai EPCO suddenly stopped bid for sale, including all gross bidding by market. Therefore, this is not an issue of the concerning the adequacy of the capacity in short peak, but energy shortage in relatively long time. So we concluded that this is the original cause of the current event in Japan. Okay, I'm moving to the next part of my presentation. The second stage of the reason why the event happened and continued long is the issue on the market operator and regulator. As concluded at first, it can be estimated that the market design and operation has not been mature in Japan, I would say. So, as far as the discussion of the EMSC, as of March 2020, is 9 months before the event. EMSC realized the risk of the current gross bidding system because it's just voluntary to ask the big nine from the regulator, and criteria is quite obscure. So it was pointed out there would be a risk by intentional market operation. EMSC also recommendation to improve the situation at the time, like non-discriminate behavior and transparency and unbundling of the generation and retail section in the big nines, and so on. However, the discussion has been continuous until now, and the improvement has not done so far. Also, as of October 2020, the 2 months before the event, FTC, the Fair Trade Commission, and METI announced under joint signature on the sample of the doubtful behavior against the Anti-Monopoly Act, like this. Unfortunately, so far, after the event, EMSC announced that the doubtful behavior has not inspected concerning the current event. But the inspection by the FTC is undergoing. And another defect in market design is a lack of fail-safe. So far in Japan, there is no automatic monitoring system. The automatic monitoring system, such as ATP, and New York ISO. This is why the event with long continuous high price has been neglected by the market operator and regulator for 2 weeks since the beginning of the event. And EMSC also mentions insider information in October 2020. According to the Q&A list by EMSC, output reduction over 100 megawatt is considered as insider information, and therefore it shall be published in the information by the website of EMSC. However, the condition of the output reduction is defined as is estimated to continue more than 24 hours. So, if a generator would stop the output reduction in 1 hour within the day restriction, daily reduction, especially for the long time, peak time in the day, it would not be considered as insider information. So, the rule can make a loophole and far from those in US and Europe. And another defect in the market rule is imbalanced price. So actually, the EMSC also recognized that the current imbalanced price system in Japan is not mature, and it is needed to improve it as soon as possible. The discussion in the EMSC was successfully finished in the September of 2020, but unfortunately, the enforcement of the improved rule was planned in March 2022. So it was unfortunate that the event attacked with time gap for the enforcement. If it had been done for 2020, before the 2020, the event might not occur in the first place. Finally, in my mind, retailers, especially independent new players, was not caused, but those affected by the event. However, many media argues the event was caused by the retailer, especially for their poor behavior, say prisoner's dilemma. Of course, the lack of demand response in many retailers in Japan was a fatal weak point. So there should make more effort to realize a certain measure of the demand response for the next event like this. This is a graph that's shown by the EMSC during the event. As you can see, the generator bid for sale are all sold out, and there happens prisoner's dilemma by retailers. So, as a conclusion, I'd like to say the event that happened in this winter in Japan was not unprecedented event, abnormal event that have never happened in the world. This was neither caused by extreme weather nor unstable renewables. the direct cause became to be clear as shortage of the LNG stocks. However, the original cause was the trouble in nuclear reactors owned by one of the big nines. And because of the lack of the fail-safe schemes in Japan so far, non-discriminatory and transparency is very poor, and automatic monitoring market power is done, and there are a lot of the loophole. So, as a final conclusion, I'd like to say simply that fairness and transparency is quite important to make a mature market that is believed by all market players. Thank you for kind attention.
Okay, very good, very good. I think it shows clearly that the market design was shown up. It is. Can the other two speakers please turn themselves back on? Hold on, let's get rid of this here now myself. Get rid of the chat. Okay. Matthew? Okay, great. Okay, so listen, there's plenty of questions here and all the rest, but if you guys can see Slido as well, I probably won't get to all of them, and we'll see how we go. So I have a question. I think it comes from it actually comes. I think there's a similar question in here in one of the questions in Slido, so I'll ask it as well. I mean, this is one of the reasons that this, just a bit of history for everybody, one of the reasons this particular workshop has come about is this used to be the forecasting workshop. Okay, it was always the forecasting workshop, and then I don't know, I can't remember. Charlie can tell us. I think 3-4 years ago, I think Charlie, ESIG decided to make it into ESIG and markets because forecasting and markets are so closely aligned, etc. Okay, and I think you can see from this that is true. Okay. But I think that there's several of the questions, and when we go into the museum, they're of the view, some of the questions say, this is stuff you can't forecast, right? This is a sentiment in some of the questions, right? And also some of the questions are talking about how would you do market design in cases like this. So I want to go through the panel and ask you some of the questions about, is it true you can't forecast these events? Are these things that just happen? And then, can you design markets to deal with them when they do happen? So it's a sort of two-sided question. Ellise, I'll start with you.
No worries, thanks. I think it probably depends on the event as to whether you're going to be able to forecast it or not. Obviously, I think the weather services industry is coming up the learning curve with us in terms of forecasting for renewables and the new needs and different forecasting tools that we're going to need. So I think as that evolves, there will be to some extent some enhanced capability to forecast things that we couldn't previously. And I did see one of the questions was asking, I think, about putting smoke in the weather models. And yeah, that's something we're looking at in Australia. So, examples like that, you might be able to enhance your forecasting capability. But I think there's always going to be an element of stuff that you can't forecast, downbursts on tornadoes taking out your lines and things like that. You never, while you might be able to identify that there's a risk of it, unless that risk is high enough for you to act, I don't think you're ever going to be able to accurately forecast exactly when that's going to be and where that's going to occur. So you have to, of course, run the system with enough fat, I suppose, or enough mechanisms and controls in place that you can withstand things like that. And maybe you have to just reconfigure the system on a certain risk or probability that something might happen and hope that you can hold on and withstand it. But I mean, our systems aren't designed for 100% reliability. That's gold plating. Nobody's got that. So I think there's always going to be an element of things that we won't be able to manage.
Okay, but just as a follow-up there, and in your talk yourself, you did mention this, there appears to be, and again, this is anecdotal in the world, that more of the events we're seeing have cross-coupling between things. So, for example, in Texas, which we're not going to talk about because we're not supposed to, but anyway, it got very cold and the gas rose up. So there's a sort of a coupling, and you've noticed that as well, haven't you? In fact, in your case, this cross-coupling saved you because one cross-coupling event seemed to cancel out another cross-coupling event. Is that right? But
yeah, I mean,
so
that was
if,
right in the case of the smoke and our
yeah,
demand forecasts for that day. But I'd say that, yeah, like these events seem to be compounding. And that's why I kind of touched on that whole cool change and thunderstorm event, because they're quite statistically probable in terms of there's always going to be a cool change come through after our heat wave. That's how it works. But the compounding of the effects that now has on the renewables in the system means it's becoming a more and more challenging. And it's almost like a tail event for the electricity system, where it's quite a statistically probable weather event.
okay, and therefore it becomes a fat tail event, isn't that it? Am I right?
That's the one.
Hey,
Yeah,
there you go.
that's
I know my tails. Okay, listen, I'm going to shift on to Matthew there on the second part of that question, Matthew, because some of the questions, again, if you read through them, some of the questions have a sentiment about them. Can you design markets to handle these? I think there's one that specifically asked that. But, on the market design side, can you design a market to take care of this? You get a tail event, the market handles it. I know that's very simplistic, but nonetheless.
I think at the moment, no, it's really hard. So a lot of the challenges we face in GB, we've kind of, as system operator and residual balancer and the person who steps in when the market doesn't deliver, we've kind of taken on dealing with those tail events just because of the kind of the buck stops with us. I think as we move forward, I think making sure you've got the transparency of data flowing through to all the parties so they can start to get involved in solving some of these problems with you, I think is the way we're going with it in GB. But yeah, it's really difficult, because how do you incentivize the market to do things that really isn't valuable? I mean, I think about our frequency response holding, like we pay for it, we buy it, we run our own markets to do that. I mean, we've launched this year, we've gone in a more probabilistic approach and sort of surfaced it and gone to industry like, how much do you think we should be spending to secure the system? Because we can spend up here and get that gold plated, but actually we think the value point's about here. I think it's a long way before you kind of hands-off markets will solve some of these tail events.
But just to follow on then from that, I mean, I heard it, I think, from Ellise as well. I mean, is it true to say that system operators are now looking at these events and saying, you're not going to design your system to survive it completely, because you can't. You just said it. You put your hand up and said, hey, up here, very, gold plate is very expensive, and you're going to go down here. So that means you're going to have more of these events. That's just what you said. So is the attitude learn to manage them rather than avoid them? I think Ellise, you said the same thing. At least I thought you did. Yeah. Okay. So is that the way things are going?
I think so.
A trend, is that
yeah, that is the trend. I think you're always going to get caught out, and it's the compounding and the things, the unforeseens, that no matter how much you think you've got every scenario covered, you're not going to have the perfect solution in place. So it's about having the reactive capability, I think, to deal with things as they come along, and then building that into the future. So I think it's an evolution, because I think Ellise, hopefully, well, from what she was talking through, that compounding effect, you're not going to expect this and that all at the same time. You can't plan for it. You've kind of got your minimum standards, but really getting all those compounding factors in, you're always going to get caught out by the unexpected. So it is about managing, it's about reacting, but it's about having a set of tools that enable you to do that. And that's where we got caught out, because I mean, one of our big things is we've got emergency instruction. That's how we resolve it in the worst case scenario. When we start talking about using it, everyone went, nah, you can't do that. So it's part of it is, have you got the right tools in place to do it in an emergency if you need to?
Yeah, but I think Ellise said, I'm not going to continue this discussion, Ellise, I think, said something along the lines that these events are becoming more coupled, and statistically then they're becoming more likely to happen. So, but anyway, we'll park there to continue. So, I'm going to give you the most difficult question, I'm afraid. Your event was extraordinary, a very interesting event, because it also had I call it poor market design flaw inside it as well. In addition to the same, so in some ways it was more extreme. And I know that Japan's market is very young. It's a very young market. It's only in existence, is it 2 years? 18 months, 2 years. It's very new. Yeah. So, and stuff happened. So has Japan learned from that? Has that been a good learning experience? mean, let's be clear about it. California, for those of us old enough here, most of us are not, Yo and me are, and Charlie is for sure. I don't think Matthew or Ellise are old enough to remember this, but back in 2000, I mean, the Californians thought they designed the greatest electricity market of all time, and it just basically collapsed. So have they learned a good lesson? Is it a good lesson or is it a bad lesson? Because in California, what happened is the lesson they learned made them very cautious for many years.
Well, unfortunately, in Japan, California's case, especially in the early 2000s, we catch the information also liberalization, deregulation is bad thing for electricity business. So many people believe so at that time. So we have quite a delay to unbundling and deregulation over 10 years or 20 years behind the Europe and the US. This was a sad situation in Japan, I have to say.
Okay, so it's a good learning experience.
Yes, we should have to do so. Trying. Well, how to say? That's in my personal opinion. Japan has still have old players have still quite heavy power, market power. So many people are reluctant to change their mind.
Yeah.
Even
okay.
now.
Because and I don't want you to respond to this, but my understanding is a lot of there was several suppliers went out of business because of this. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay, and that's a bad experience commercially. Okay, let's go to the questions that are popping up in Slido, and you guys have Slido in front of you. I'm going to try to group them together. So, Ellise, there's a bunch of questions here about the high temperature. Yeah, there's one, what physical reasons for cutting out high temperature? There's another one, Ellise, is the cutout of wind facilities at high temperature an outlier event? And then there's another one, Ellise, what proportion of all wind was the wind facility that cut out at high temperatures? Do you think you can handle all three together?
Yeah, no worries. I would say it's still an outlier event, but it's becoming more frequently. I think it occurred about 3 times in the summer of 2019, 2020, when we had those really bad bushfires, but then the summer just gone, it didn't occur at all, so it didn't get hot enough basically for it to happen. So I think it's still an outlier event, but it's something we are learning to manage. We've actually built some tools to be able to assess the wind at risk, and the way we do that is to then reach out to the wind farm operators and talk to them about their expectations, and trying to get them to actually forecast it a little bit for themselves as well. So it's a bit of a joint forecasting effort at the moment for that one. We need them to be able to help us because they know how their plant works and how it's configured and how it's likely to cut out better than we do. But then we need to be able to assess that there's a risk of that, and understand what the risk to the system is. So, the way we've taken it is that it's quite a joint effort for forecasting. We're always going to have to look at it from a system operations layer, but the individual operators also need to understand how their plant works, and obviously they're best placed to do that and give us that information. So in terms of why they cut out, we understand it's a number of things, but mostly it's the protection systems on the turbines. So there's actually, we think, a number of temperature sensors on turbines, such as transmission temperature, ambient internal temperature, and the gearbox temperature. And each of these have obviously temperature protection on them to switch off. And we found that they're quite different across different sites. So we get hub height temperature measurements, and if you compare that to the response of the farm, there is quite varied responses across each of the sites. I think the last question there was how big. I think the biggest event we had, so I was talking about Victoria, which is where Melbourne is. Their summer peak is about 10 gigawatts. The worst event we had on a day was we lost 1 gigawatt of wind generation, so about 10% there that we lost. But since those events, so we've had 1.5 years of wind growth since then. The wind generation's actually doubled in Victoria since then. So, if we go into this summer, we're probably looking at, with the same weather event, we're probably looking at a couple of gigawatts of loss.
Okay, good. So, Matthew, I'm going to bundle a few together here for you, and they're not actually related, but you'll be able to knock one out of the park on the very first answer. So, can you curtail renewables through negative pricing? Hold on, and you're going to answer that one quickly. But I think the more interesting question, you glossed over the issue of nuclear. Well, you didn't gloss over it. You said you paid a nuclear power plant maybe to turn off, but nuclear flexibility is a very, very hot topic in some countries. Can you talk a little bit about it? So do you want to answer the first one? Can you curtail renewables through negative pricing? You're on mute, Matthew.
Damn it. Sorry, everyone. Yeah, so effectively GB, we have a kind of hour ahead balancing mechanism where everybody submits prices. System operator is the only person who can effectively enact trades at that. It's kind of after all the markets have sorted itself out. Wind and other renewable sources that are big enough to participate in that market will submit negative bid prices. They're trying to recoup their subsidies for lost revenue if we turn them off. So yeah, we do get negative bid prices. Just to put it into context, the worst weekend in terms of actions last year, when I said we're adding 24 CCGTs, we spent £51 million GB over a weekend. That's against an annual cost of about 1.2 billion. So really heavy weekend. We normally spend between sort of 1 and 2 million a day, 51 million. But in that same mechanism, nuclear does offer a degree of flexibility, a couple of megawatts, maybe tens of megawatts, but the prices they're offering in those are quite extraordinarily high compared to other units. So effectively, we treat them as inflexible. We can do contracting and we can do things like move low load refueling around, or we can talk about actually taking entire units off. But the nuclear regulation in GB, the safety case that they have for operating those units means that we're very limited in the options and flexibility we get from them. We're hoping with the new plants that are coming online, so we get definitely one, maybe two big new stations in Hinkley C and Sizewell C, that we will get a lot more flexibility capability from those units. Because when you're talking about 20 gig demands and a 3.6 gigawatt nuclear power station on your system, you want some flexibility on it if that's the only big machine running.
And I mean, EDF own the nuclear power plants in the UK, not it, or GB? Note everyone, there's a big difference between UK and GB. We won't go into that. But they own them. But in France, they're more. I think they're more flexible. Is that? Can you comment on that, or if you know anything about it? I mean, they do seem more flexible. Yeah,
so similar unit designs on at least one of the stations in GB. The technical capability of the station's there, but it is generally, I mean, in the discussions we had during the process last year to take a unit off at Sizewell, the big thing is around the safety case with the nuclear regulator in GB. So while the technical capability might be there, it's kind of the political regulatory will to allow it to happen.
Yeah. Offline sometime I'll tell you a story I heard from in the US about the nuclear power plants and the regulatory issues. That nuclear power plants are not only the physics, there's much more about them because of their nature. Okay. I'm going to give you two questions here. I mean, they're related. So how is the Japanese market designed, right? And then also, well, badly, obviously, but that's a different question. And then I think, there's another one there. Sorry. All right, there was another one there with it. I'm sorry. What do you think would be addressed in Japan first? Market power or getting demand to be more responsive?
Okay, so
who designed it? And then
first of all, I'd like to answer to the first question: who designs the Japanese market? It is very quite difficult but important question. Simply, market design discussed in the EMSC, and this is a part of the METI, Japan. Unfortunately, the Japanese regulator concerning the electricity market is not different from the government. It's not independent. So almost things are discussed in the METI, and the checkings, regulating things also done by METI. This is a quite immature situation for the adequate market design, I think.
Okay, and then the second question then about what do you think will change first? You said it yourself, market. I mean, Japan has an enormous market power issue, and then is it going to be the market power issue, or is the demand side going to address it?
So, as you may know, in Japan's deregulation, complete deregulation has done in 2016, only 5 years ago. And unbundling, just legal unbundling, has done only 1 year ago. it was 2020. So as Mark mentioned, our market is quite young, like a baby. So the first thing we should go to unbundling more. I mean, the ownership unbundling. And also, EMC mentions it should be done unbundling between the generator and retailer within the old utilities. So this is the first priority things, I think.
Okay, but it's progressing in Japan. It's going
Yes.
the right direction. Okay, that's good. There's a question for all of you. I lost it here. Hold on, there's something, wait. Yeah, there's a question in here, everyone. Yeah, here we go. Everyone, how do you see the increasingly renewable generation mix being impacted by tail events from the existing historical record? Now, I'm going to turn that around as well. And, do you see that, that's sort of asking you, how do you see renewables being impacted by tail events? But there's also the obvious question, do renewables add to the tail events? So two-sided question. So are tail events now going to be more often, more impactful or less impactful because of renewables? Do you want to answer that while you're on?
Me?
Do you want to attempt that? Yeah, because it's for everyone, but go on.
Okay, first of all, for me, in Japan, we have not so renewable so far, only 20% for renewables. So as far as we are only 10%. So in Japan, we have no situation to fear from the tail event by the renewables. Essentially, but many people argue renewables make a risk for the grid now. So this is a mind gap. So we can learn more from the European and the Australians and US experiment.
Okay, and he's English. He's not in Europe, or he's the English. Don't forget them. They're a separate country entirely. Whatever. But that's me having a joke. Okay, so I think you can learn from the other two. I think that's key. So I don't know, Matthew, you're smiling there. So, do you think renewables going to increase the tail events, or are tail events going to impact renewables and then renewables impact them? What do you think?
I think there's a really bad point in the middle of the transition, and I think GB's potentially just got through that bad point where we're aiming for effectively all zero carbon by 2025, which is basically nukes, wind, solar, bit of water. That's it. We'll have bought all of our system strength services through other means that will get on the system in other ways. And I think once we've got to that point, there are the fluctuations, but we've noticed that kind of on the larger scale, as we've got more diversity, as we've grown the fleet size, those diversions, the impact of them is decreased as we get a lot of fronts moving through, as Ellise talked about in Australia. Those fronts moving through with the geographic diversity, they have less of an impact. So I think there's a really bad point at the beginning when you've got a minimal penetration and you really feel the impact of things. But as it's grown, I think it's gone less. I mean, we've kind of the only similar one that we've got to Elise's kind of high cutout is high cutout due to high wind speeds. So that's probably our biggest concern in terms of those tail events, is when you get those really big, very fast moving storms moving across GB, you do get large amounts of cutout. But it's things that we've seen before. We've got pretty good at forecasting it. We understand how it works. And when you understand how those things work, you can adapt and work around them.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you believe there's sort of a bad spot to get through, and once you get through to the other side, it's better. Yeah, that's fair enough. This session is not about resource adequacy, right, as such, but if you bring this further to the resource adequacy question, do you think that that's going to be an issue?
The adequacy, yeah. But that's really the next big challenge. I think we can get to the zero carbon, but it's what happens to lost money from the units that don't get run very often, but you do need them on those cold, still dark days, our peaks, middle of winter when it's dark, and how you get that and still meet the carbon targets of various commitments. That's the real next challenge. Is it hydrolyzers? Is it lots of long duration storage? Is it abate CCUS and things?
Yeah, because your 2025 is to be able to run at zero carbon. It doesn't mean you're going to be running at zero carbon all the time. So that's the next bit. Okay, I think that's important to clarify for everyone who's on the call, because I think a lot of people think you're going to look at zero carbon totally in 2025. You're not. Okay. Ellise, do you want to take that? Yeah, that's your job as far as I know.
Yeah.
Ellise, do you want to take that on? You know, what do you think? You know, do they impact renewables and vice versa? What do you think?
Absolutely do. I mean, obviously the weather now impacts more of our system than it used to ever before. So from that perspective, I think tail end weather events are more and more challenging. But I think on the flip side of that, the renewable plant is actually the most flexible and dispatchable plant that we've ever had on our system. So if you look at, you know, the startup of a wind farm versus the startup of a big coal unit, or the inflexibility of a nuclear plant versus the switching that we can do on wind and solar, it's actually the most flexible plant we've ever had, and it's the most dispatchable in a sense. It's just resource constrained. So I think while potentially weather tail events become more challenging, there's a whole bunch of other tail events on the grid that actually become less challenging for having wind and solar and renewables on the system.
Give me an example of one of those, could you?
We have an aging coal fleet here in Australia, and they're all slated for a number of retirements over the next 10 years. So because of that, we're seeing more and more challenges in their reliability. They seem to drop off every second day at the moment, with, you know, various tube leaks and just a little bit of reliability challenges that we have. We do not have any of that with the wind and solar plant. I know it's newer, but we really have very, very few unplanned outages on any of the wind and solar generation. Obviously there's transmission work and things that go on where we have challenges, but yeah, the aging thermal fleet certainly has more unplanned challenges than the wind and solar do.
Yeah. Okay.
So can I ask a short question for Ellise?
Sure.
When the European and US and Australian people say that it is challenging, so it is it means the negative or positive meaning. My simple question for I'm the translator.
Challenge is negative.
Just negative. How about you, Ellise? Challenge is a negative or positive meaning?
It's got a negative meaning in this context, Joe.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, but I think you have to take it the context of how you say it. I mean, so I think the way Ellise was saying it, the challenges are coming from the thermal plant at the so you know you want to be very true, Ellise. I mean, it depends how you say it.
Yeah, exactly right.
I think
challenges can be great as we move towards, you know, decarbonising the systems and things like that. That's an excellent challenge.
That's right.
And a very
so
positive
we must
thing.
overcome the challenge.
Yeah.
That's right. But
okay.
Unfortunately, sorry.
No, go on, Yo. Continue.
In Japan, the context, the trend is completely negative. So we must give up to install the renewables. Many Japanese people believe so, even now, unfortunately.
Yeah. But just not to dwell on this point, but I mean, I've been to Japan twice or three times with you, and you know, what I see in Japan now is what we saw in Europe and the United States 15 or 20 years ago. 15 or 20 years ago. And in fact, at Charlie's age, like 50 years ago, you know, people said you couldn't do this. So I think it's fine. Okay, listen, we've got just one or two more minutes left. I'm going to ask one question of Ellise. There's one question, because some of the other questions I think have been answered and all the rest of it. There's one here, an anonymous for anyone who wants to answer it. When do wind and PV forecasting, are you doing them site by site or directly forecast the whole area? And there's another one in here. Where is it? Sorry, hold on. Where's the one about doing it on a site by site basis? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Do you want to answer that one? Someone. Is PV or solar forecasting done on a site by site basis, or is it done on a whole area basis?
Yeah, it actually depends on Yeah, the size of the system and the visibility of the system. So obviously behind the meter rooftop solar, we don't have full visibility of. Some of it is still consumption metered. So we take sample systems and upscale to the total regional capacity to forecast on a regional basis for those sites, or at least on a, we do it to a 2-digit postcode or zip code sort of basis as our most granular forecast for those. But then the large scale sites, which generally are above 30 megawatts for us, but it can be anything above 5 megawatts, we do individually. And that's wind and solar.
But, and it also depends on the application, though, doesn't it, as well, what you're doing it for?
Yeah, that's right. It depends on whether you're looking at your resource adequacy. For a region, to some extent, you might put a statistical layer of model over it for the whole region, or some scenario sort of analysis on it, versus looking at the individual site's resource adequacy and its forecast.
Okay, that's good. I thought I'd get someone to answer that because it's good for the audience to hear that for education. So listen, our time is up. Charlie's going to kick me off here, so I'm going to wrap this up. Charlie, I'll wrap this up. Hold on, I get that. Charlie, just for his information, Charlie provides us all with text that we have to read out like good boys. So time to wrap up. Okay, you know, so look, I'm going to ad-lib this myself. Why not? It's time to wrap this up. I think it was an interesting session. I think it went well. I think the resource adequacy question is a separate question, and that's one of the reasons I asked the question the way I did. It's because we're dealing with today with the operations part, and it looks like to me in operations we're in good shape from renewables point of view, but the resource adequacy question is still there. So I want to thank everyone. There is another session on this Thursday. I can't remember what it's called. I think Charlie's going to tell us. There's one on Thursday. There's an operator's perspective on the impact of forecast and operations going to be chaired by Jay Caspery of Grid Strategies. It's free, just as this is. So we look forward to seeing you all next Tuesday for the next session. I'd like to thank our speakers, in particular those who got up in the middle of the night. I don't know, I was going to ask a question, are you going back to bed? But I don't know, it's up to you. If I were you, I'd go back to bed. But I'll put it this way, I think we're all going to bed because in fact, it's 9, everyone here is going back to bed for different reasons because myself and Matt are definitely going to bed. Okay, take care everybody. Thanks Ellise, thanks Joe, thanks Magill. Talk to you.